Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. So Kyrie Irving gets to play ball again in New York City.
I had no idea. Congratulations.
Yeah.
What happened?
Now, with respect to the vax mandates for police and fire, those are still in force.
In New York and here in Chicago still.
Right. So...
and there's a new lawsuit trying to stop that.
As we mentioned earlier in the program... there's one set of rules here when it comes to professional athletes, just as we saw for 2 years, one set of rules when it comes to politicians, the faces of our cities and states, and another set of rules for the hoi polloi. And that also includes, even in big pharma companies, interesting report in realclearinvestigations.com about one such pharma company that hasn't gotten a lot of ink during the pandemic. Eli Lilly. And for more on this, we're pleased to be joined by Clayton Fox, who's a former Tablet Fellow who has been published in Tablet, the LA Magazine, Brownstone Institute, RealClearInvestigations.com. Clayton, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. And so you offer in this piece some poignant anecdotes. We've heard a lot of those over the last 2 years about longtime Eli Lilly employees who had to choose between what they thought was in their best interest medically or what was a matter of conscience versus their job, like Mandy Van Gorp.
Yeah, I spoke to more than 12 former employees and a couple, current employees who obviously couldn't be named. And to their credit, one of them came to us. We did not seek out the story. They brought it to us. And were very brave, a lot of them, in deciding to go on the record. Initially, a lot of them were sort of hesitant, as you might imagine, because, we live in a pretty fractious time and people really gang up on you based on your personal choices. And so ultimately, as you can see, several people did come on the record and were willing to share what happened with us. I mean, just in brief, and people are, I encourage you to go read the piece at realclearinvestigations.com. But in summary, the company on August 12th, 2021, totally reversed their initial sort of position, which was that they were not going to require company-wide mandates, and issued essentially a company-wide mandate that had there were few paths around it, right? They told everyone, for example, well, you can apply for a religious exemption if you have a sincere religious exemption to getting vaccinated. And so a lot of people applied and were approved. But in the case of salespeople, for example, or anyone at the company who had a quote unquote customer facing role, meaning they had to interact with customers, once their religious accommodation was approved, it came with a note in that same email saying, well, but you also see customers face to face. So actually, you're going to need to seek a non-customer facing role inside the company, or you will be fired on November 15th.
Did the company consider natural immunity, or if somebody had COVID, did that impact any shape or form this policy they had in place?
Very good question. So several of the employees we interviewed who were given religious or medical accommodation, primarily religious, did have proof of COVID antibodies at the time they were fired. And in one case, at least, the woman in question actually had been part of an internal program at Lilly where every 3 months she was getting tested for antibodies to contribute to their research. So the company did their own testing, knew she had antibodies, and fired her anyway because, according to Lilly, natural immunity was not sufficient for a safe workplace.
And, this persists in some places. Of course, we see the relaxation of these mandates and so-called mitigations. But you still have the D.C. press corps beating the drum, even now as that sad little man, Tony Fauci, says it's unlikely we'll see another wave. But New York Magazine yesterday, it's not over. An infectious disease doc, Abrar Karan at Stanford, says we don't know what might be coming next, and we need to prepare. We need to be resilient enough and nimble enough to reimpose these mandates that were ineffectual by just about every measure if there is another, Omicron part 2.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been sort of on the COVID beat now for quite a while, and so I feel pretty intimately aware of the ins and outs of the pandemic, including the fact that, yeah, there probably will be more waves, right? The virus isn't going anywhere. Obviously, all of the measures we took to quote unquote eradicate it did not work. It has not been eradicated. It's traveling quite freely throughout the world. So sure, in one form or another, it will be back. But the question we have to address then, and this is specifically vis-a-vis the Lilly story, right, is, what country do we live in? Because I was under the impression that it was a country in which we had, religious and medical freedom. If that is the case, then it doesn't really matter if there's subsequent waves of, SARS-CoV-2 for the next 20 years. That doesn't justify people with sincere objections to a vaccine being fired, humiliated, and run out of town. That's just my opinion, but
Right.
I think we need to be pretty clear-eyed about what country we live in.
And also the impact of the rush to, as you say, marginalize, embarrass, demoralize people. And then, as we've seen with some medical institutions, oh, you can come back now.
Yeah.
And what that does to the morale of the workforce in important sectors like public safety or public health.
Absolutely. I mean, some of the doctors I've corresponded with over the last several months are experts in public health. Now, granted, everyone's a quote-unquote expert in public health, so I suppose that...
yeah. We're all epidemiologists now, right? Yeah.
Well, no, but even the epidemiologists, right, argue about who's really the expert. Well, no, I'm really the expert because I went to Iowa. Well, I went to Harvard. I mean, it's completely insane. They're all insane. But what some of the doctors I spoke with, who I trust, have been saying for many months now is that this sort of blanket, everybody has to take the vaccine, man, woman, child, regardless of... One woman I spoke to at Eli Lilly has multiple sclerosis, okay?
Mm.
She was denied a medical exemption on that basis.
Oh, my God.
Okay, this isn't, MS is not a joke, right? And she was very concerned about her health because the sort of effects of the vaccine on people with autoimmune conditions has, at that point at least, had not been thoroughly documented. And so they denied her medical exemption. So to your point, some of the epidemiologists I've spoken with are like, they must realize, or maybe they don't realize, the CDC, that their behavior now is destroying public health for generations, because you're taking people like that who probably more or less trusted you their whole lives. Then you're telling them you have multiple sclerosis, but that doesn't count as an objection to vaccination, and that person is never going to trust you again.
Something else to the example you gave, you were talking about what kind of country, asking the question, what kind of country do we live in when it comes to personal health decisions, when it comes to conscience, rights of conscience. This email that Lilly HR sent out: if Catholic, please ensure the documentation addresses the determination of the Vatican's doctrinal office that it is morally acceptable for Catholics to receive the COVID-19 vaccines. So they're saying if you want a religious exemption and you're Catholic, you have to explain why you disagree with the Vatican, which, by the way, shows their ignorance of Catholicism. But it's still, so now you want to have a theological discussion with your HR department. I'm happy to, but it's not going to go well for them. Regardless of their lack of understanding that, the papal infallibility does not extend outside the catechism to matters of vaccines and labor economics and climate policy and all the other things the Pope weighs in on. But I digress, because the real point is, you want an environment in corporate America where you're having a theological discussion with some HR representative and your job is on the line?
Well, right. Precisely, and I hope we captured sort of that insanity that these employees were put through. And that was the main sort of feeling that, in speaking with them, most of them had, right? It wasn't that they didn't understand completely why it was happening, although of course that was also true. It was the manner in which it was all conducted. It was conducted in such a sort of disjointed, unequal way. Catholics were being asked for one thing, non-Catholics were being asked for other forms of documentation. There wasn't an equal standard. Like I said, people with multiple sclerosis were denied medical, and then some people who were denied medical went back and said, okay, you're denying medical. Well, I also hold sincere religious objections to vaccination. I didn't want to reveal that because those, religious objections to vaccination and or abortion, are often marginalized in our society. And I didn't want you, my company, my employer, to know my religious objection. But now I'm going to appeal on that basis. And then the company very coldly responded to those people with, well, you missed the deadline for application, so we won't even review your religious request.
So what happened to the people that you interviewed for your article? Are they still with Eli Lilly? Have some stayed? Have some moved on?
Mostly not. Mostly have moved on. Some have found new jobs. Some have not. Some are in a process of, seeking legal action against the company. Some cannot because they accepted a severance agreement. Which sort of forbid them from ever seeking legal recourse. But, they had to do it because they needed the money. They have big families, kids in college, et cetera. And, one woman broke down on the phone with me crying, and we didn't get this in the story. And she said, please don't forget about the people, my coworkers. She knew at least 12 coworkers. And that's in addition to the 12 in the story. So just to be clear, she said, I knew at least 12 people who got vaccinated against their will in order to keep their job at Lilly, and none of them, they were all very scared or felt they'd gone against their own convictions. She was very upset at the people who actually ultimately did take the vaccine in order to keep their job.
Oh, it's so sad. I mean, it's sad. Parents are sad too when they have to vaccinate their kids so that they don't have to be quarantined in school too. But Dan, what were you saying?
Well, and what is Eli Lilly's policy going forward to the extent or have they now relaxed the vax mandate, or are they going to be requiring boosters here as the next phase? Yeah,
well, we wish they would have responded to our very detailed request for information. They did respond. They did respond, but it was a boilerplate response. They did not address our specific questions, of which that was one. What I can tell you, and again, this did not make it in the piece, is that the people who were given a religious or medical accommodation who work at headquarters in Indianapolis, the rules for them as of November 15th were that they had to still wear a mask, they still had to keep 6 feet of distance when possible, and they were only allowed to take off their mask if they were in a closed room with the door closed. So after November 15th at Eli Lilly headquarters in Indianapolis, you had a situation where essentially unvaccinated employees who had been given accommodation were singled out and marked publicly, and everyone else was able to resume business as usual with no social distancing and no masking. So when you talk about humiliation, I really can't think of anything more extreme than that in the workplace. I mean, it's like wearing a dunce cap.
Yeah, ascientific-based humiliation too. Clayton Fox, former Tablet Fellow, published in Tablet, LA Magazine, Brownstone Institute, and Real Clear Investigations. That's where you can find his piece on Eli Lilly that we were talking about, which we'll tweet out. A Pharma Giant imposed follow the mandate on vaccine objectors. They are now ex-workers. Excellent piece, Clayton Fox. Thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Hear about the big stories of the day, then talk about them right here on Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
You have faced uncertainty and anxiety, and now your retirement is looming. You might be asking yourself, did I put enough away? Will I have to pay a lot of taxes? Will my spouse be okay if something happens to me? Total Clarity Wealth Management can